Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Laurel Sauer.
And I'm Alan Gerstel. Thanks for joining us for Heritage, a series of unique award-winning programs originally produced by WXEL's partners at the Education Network.
Tonight, we continue our look back at the Holocaust. Last week, we brought you Norman Frojman's story. Norman survived the Warsaw Ghetto and a number of concentration camps.
Tonight, you will meet Rosette Goldstein, a child hidden by farmers in France. Her story mirrors the story of Anne Frank.
The other story is told by Liesel Bogart. It concerns a huge public relations hoax created by the Nazis to fool the rest of the world, even as they continued their atrocities. So here now is the second part of the Holocaust, What If?
During the 1930s, France welcomed Jewish refugees from Poland, Germany, and other countries caught up in the hatred spewed by Adolf Hitler and his minions. But all that changed when Germany invaded France in 1940.
Things were getting very bad in France. You weren't allowed to, as a Jew, you were not allowed to shop until late afternoon, and at that point everything was gone from the stores. The Jews were not allowed to ride in the subway except in the last car.
Jews were also excluded from public life. They couldn't attend theaters or movies, nor could they work as doctors, lawyers, or teachers. Rosette Goldstein's mother and father were born in Poland and were childhood friends. They emigrated to Germany and then to France, where they married in 1937. Rosette was born in 1938.
My father heard about a way to protect my mother and I. And this way of protecting them was to work for the French government and the occupying forces. He was given a paper stating that if he worked as a lumberjack in a small camp in the countryside in France, that they wouldn't touch my mother and I.
So her father, David Adler, went to work cutting down trees.
And in the evening, he was allowed to go through the countryside. Most of the men were let go after work. This was right at the beginning. And they would go to the different farms in the area and ask for, they would barter their working. They would help the farmers, and in return, the farmers would give them some food to send back to Paris.
As the situation deteriorated, her father grew increasingly concerned and didn't trust the paper that provided so-called protection for the family.
So he and my mother, I guess, discussed that I should be hidden. He had been going to this one farmer, Monsieur Martin, to help him with chores and again to get some food to send back to us in Paris. And he said to Monsieur Martin one day, he said, I have a little girl and she's three and a half, almost 4 years old. He says, I need to hide her. Would you take her in?
The farmer said he needed some time to consult with his wife.
And the next day he said to him, I have 3 daughters, we have 3 daughters, we'll have 4. It was as simple as that.
Rosette's mother put her on a train with a Christian neighbor because it was too dangerous for a Jewish woman to take a train. The little girl was scared out of her wits.
We got to the farm in Volandry, and my father was there. It was the evening, my father was there, and I was always very, very close to my dad. So that him being there was wonderful.
Her father would come from the nearby work farm in the evenings and play with her. One day, she remembers, her mother appeared, despite the fear of arrest by Nazi troops.
Somehow she got to the farm, and my father stayed overnight. Next morning, he went right to the forest to work without going back to the camp. All of a sudden, They burst into the farmhouse. We had a fireplace, and I could see them standing there with guns. And they asked where David Adler was. They said that if he wasn't back in 1 hour, that they were taking my mother and I and deporting us. Monsieur Martin went right to the forest. He took his bicycle and saddled a horse. I don't remember that, which he did, but he went to the forest and told my father, and my father immediately went back to the camp. My mother disappeared, back to Paris. Don't know how. And somehow, I guess they forgot me.
Her father would still come in the evenings, but this was 1942, and deportations from France began, mostly to the Auschwitz death camp.
And I used to run down the path from the farm and wait for him. And he would whistle. He had an old bicycle that Monsieur Martin had given him. And he would ride this bicycle, and when he saw me, he'd start to whistle a tune. So I knew it was him, and he'd scoop me in his arms and hug me. And then one day I'm waiting, and didn't show up.
All of the 70 men in the work camp had been deported to Auschwitz.
I knew, we all knew what was going on. As little as we were, we realized what was going on. My life went on on the farm. They were very, very good to me. I call the daughters my sisters of the dark days. One day, Odile, the youngest, she saw a truck stop at the end of the path with Germans coming out of it with guns. And immediately they took me, the farmers took me, put me in the next room under the mattress. And at that time, the old beds had these big springs, so that I was face down on the springs and the mattress on top of me. And they looked around the farm and took food. You know, it was a farm, so they took all kinds of food and left. Again, I was lucky. Second time, I saw them. And I ran in and told Madame Martin. And this time, she had Odile go with me on top of the barn where they kept the feed for the cows and hid me under the feed. Again, the same thing.
The family kept her hidden throughout the rest of the war. Her mother never managed to visit her again at the farm, but Rosette was protected by the Martin family until the war was over.
The Americans came in, and I remember sitting outside with the family and seeing all these planes up there, and one of the men played the accordion, and he played the Marseillaise, and we just applauded and, you know, was so happy that we were free.
She rejoined her mother in Paris. Her mother already knew that her father had been killed.
It was very hard for my mother, very difficult, because she was alone. My aunt, my uncle, and my two cousins had been taken on convoy number 8. They all died in Auschwitz.
Her father had been taken to Auschwitz and then taken on a death march to Buchenwald. Another death march to another concentration camp followed. David Adler died on April 6, 1945. The camp was freed just 5 days later, on April 11th. She learned her father's fate from a survivor who was with him at the very end.
He told us that he died saying my mother and my name.
I had a wonderful life, beautiful childhood, everything a young girl can hope for. Good schools, entertainment, travel, everything was beautiful. I also had a beautiful home and family life.
Liesel Bogart was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Growing up, she was surrounded by a large, loving family.
My immediate family were my parents. I had a brother who was 4 years older than I, and many aunts, uncles, cousins. We were 43 people in my family. When the war was over, I was the only one to return, to survive. Everybody else was brutally murdered.
Liesel's story is an all too familiar one.
This beautiful life came to a sudden stop for us in Czechoslovakia. It was March 15th, 1939. I was 13 years old at the time, and that morning we woke up and there was a noise. Looking out of our windows, there were German tanks driving in, German soldiers marching in, and overnight all the homes around us were already decorated with swastikas.
Her father owned a small store, and what happened to him was just the beginning.
That morning, first day, we came to his store. There was a sign on the door, big sign, no Jews allowed. Under Aryan management, store was taken away. Needless to say that from that day on, my father really was a broken man. He just could not face up and cope with what was happening, just the first day.
And from that day on, new laws were put in place that targeted Jews. Jews were also no longer permitted in public places. They couldn't use public transportation. Cars, motorcycles, and bicycles were confiscated. Telephones and typewriters were confiscated. And no Jews were permitted on the streets after 7 p.m. The smallest infraction of any laws was immediately punishable by death.
At first, when all the laws against the Jews were coming out, first of all, they had a way of identifying us. We had to wear the Jewish star. I still have mine here, if you want to see it. On the left side of our outer garment at all times, and which it says in German, Jude, which means Jew. This, you see, you had to wear all the time, but if somebody didn't like you, a former neighbor, friend, anybody, could point you out to any Nazi or any German on the street and say, I saw him or her not wearing the star. You were taken away to Gestapo headquarters. No questions asked. You were killed.
Her brother was placed on a transport, along with 1,000 other young men, to build the Terezín concentration camp. A few months later, her parents and her got notification that they were on the next transport. As they walked to the holding place, neighbors they had known for years turned away and would not acknowledge them.
Two reasons. They were afraid to say that they know a Jew, and second, they knew where we are being taken, what is happening to us. Nobody came to our help. At that point, we know now that the whole world knew what was happening. The whole world was silent.
They were packed into a cattle car for a day-and-a-half trip that should have taken less than 2 hours.
We were yelled at, never talked to, always yelled at to form a column of 3, and we were marched for about half hour. I was still with my parents in the same line. We came to a gate. On that gate, like in most camps, it said in German, Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes free. We entered through that gate. We were in a camp called Terezín in Czech, in German Theresienstadt. Once we entered through this gate, there we went through a selection. My father was taken someplace, my mother someplace else, and I found myself in a barrack in a very, very small area, at first with 27 girls. There was a lot of sickness. When you were sick, no doctors, no nurses, no medication, and of course you were unable to work. If you were unable, you had no use to the Nazis. And that's why, as you entered the camp, in most camps, children, babies, older people, sick, had no chance to survive. Only chance to survive if you were able to work for them as a slave labor.
The Nazis were masters of propaganda. They developed a plan to convince the world that the stories about their atrocities were not true. They would create a make-believe village and invite the International Red Cross to inspect it.
They picked our camp for the reason that before the war, Terezín was a lovely little village. It had a village green, it had a church in back with a clock tower, it was a garrison town. Of course, the people were moved out and it was turned into a concentration camp. So they decided one block of barracks around that village green would lend itself beautifully to create that village.
But Terezín was so overcrowded, the Nazis transported as many as 40,000 prisoners to other camps, so the streets wouldn't look like wall-to-wall people.
They selected 360 younger people, I was one of them, and 600 what they called extras. And we were ordered now to create this village. The barracks were painted, storefronts were created. Everything you can picture in a little village, from a grocery store, a bakery, a sewing room, doctor's office, school room, prayer room, entertainment room, coffee shop, a dance hall, a music, everything, including a bank.
They even went so far as to print fake money to be used at the bank.
And we had rehearsals and dress rehearsals. And the extras were used for, boys had to play like a soccer team, extras were used for cheering, people had to go to the bank, some had to go to school, some had to sit in a coffee shop. And then the Red Cross came, and about a day and a half, 2 days later, the Red Cross left. During the time they were there, well rehearsed ahead of time, one of the assessmen went to the sandbox, tousled little Johnny's hair, who had to play there with other children, and said, "Would you like another cookie or lollipop or a sardine?" And little Johnny had to say, "No, thank you," pulling out of his pocket some more candies. I already had enough today's sweets.
Once the Red Cross left, the order came to dismantle the phony village. And all the participants in the hoax, some 960 people, were put on the next transport to be gassed.
I was told anywhere between 8 and 12 names, actually numbers, we had no names, were omitted from that list. And I was one of the lucky ones.
She was fortunate again when the Nazis decided to give Hitler a special present. They would take 5,000 Jews from Terezín and send them to Auschwitz to be killed in one night.
5,000 Czech Jews were selected. My parents and I were in that transport. We were again herded into the cattle cars, always done at night under big lights, SS all around you. I lost my place near my parents. They already were in one car, and as I was stepping, by then they had put ramps against the car door, because the door was high and it was took too long. This was supposed to speed up the loading. And on the side of the ramp, on each side was an SS man. As I stepped on the ramp, one of the SS men pushed me off. And I fell off, tried to get up, and he pushed me down again. I had no idea what was happening, and I stayed down. The doors of the cattle cars closed, and the train left, which was the last time I saw my parents. At that point, I had no idea why I was pushed off or what was happening.
Much later, she learned she was pushed off that train because the Nazis were very exact. Their roster listed 5,000, but they actually had 5,004 prisoners, so 4 had to be excluded from the transport. She was one of them.
After the transport left, I went to the stables where the SS kept their horses. My brother was taking care of a horse. He was covered from the transports because he was needed as a stable boy, and he wasn't there. And one of the other stable boys told me, "Don't you know?" I said, "What?" "Your brother was on that transport." I had no idea.
Her brother had likely volunteered, thinking his parents and sister were on that transport, and perhaps he could help them.
The night of March 7th, out of the 5,000, only 3,800 were still alive. The rest were killed, what was called natural causes. The 3,800 went that night to their deaths, fully knowing what is happening to them. But they resisted. The law was when you entered gas chambers, you had to be undressed. They were told you're getting a shower, which of course was not the case, and they knew it. But they resisted to undress, well documented by now, and they sang to their last breath the Czech anthem and the Hatikva, which is the Jewish anthem.
Finally, on May 7, 1945, came the day that Liesel and so many others had prayed for. Their camp was liberated. But she had gotten very sick and was isolated in a typhoid barracks at the time. A friend came to the window, waving something back and forth in her hand, a slice of white bread.
Seeing that in her hand, I realized we must be free, because we heard the oncoming front, we heard the shooting and all before I lost consciousness. So we knew it can't be long anymore. And then it dawned on me, seeing that slice of white bread, and that's now 65 years later. Every morning I have a slice of toast for breakfast. I remember freedom.
And this was all done in the name of hate, and it's still going on today. It's still going on in different countries, and we haven't learned. Man has not learned.
Certainly a great deal of food for thought in all 3 stories told by those survivors. We'd like to thank Norman Frajman, Rosette Goldstein, and Liesel Bogart for sharing their incredible stories with us.
And we'd like to thank you, our viewers, for your support of these programs. I'm Laurel Sauer.
And I'm Alan Gerstel. We'll see you again next time on Heritage.
And don't forget, if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to email us at heritage@wxel.org.